Julie Bogart is the creator and owner of Brave Writer, which is an online writing and language arts program with digital products and online classes. And one thing Julie shared during the interview was that she thinks she might have done the first ever live online class for homeschoolers back in 2000. So that's why I call her an ideological ancestor of some of the new technologies and methods that we and others are now working on in alternative education. Personally, Julie homeschooled 5 kids and has worked as a professional writer, ghostwriter, and editor, and also taught theatre and writing for 10 years for a Cincinnati homeschool co-op of 300 students. She's a frequent speaker at homeschool conventions in the US, UK, and Canada, and hosting Brave Writer events all over the US, and has immense amount of experience and knowledge in this field. And I think that really came out in this conversation. So I hope you enjoy. Well, it's so great to be talking, Julie. Thanks so much for being here. And, I'd love to just hear a bit about your personal journey and how you arrived to the work that you now do. Because from what I know about it, you've had a really, really interesting journey that I think our listeners will be excited to hear.
Thank you for that. I grew up in Southern California, outside of Los Angeles, and I had the good fortune of having a mother who loved writing. And around the time I was in 7th grade, she launched her own freelance writing career. I remember her very first article she sold was called A Trail of Tips for Young Writers, and she sold it to the Boy Scouts of America. She made $25 and then turned around and used that money to permaplaque the letter. So I grew up with this enthusiasm around published writing. And as a result, she was very nourishing and nurturing to me as a young writer. I've had journals and diaries since I was pretty little. My grandmother gave me a lock and key diary in 4th grade, and I wrote in it faithfully every day. But by the time I was an adult, one of the things that just sort of happened naturally is I wound up in these editing roles. I edited a publication for a music company. I worked as an editor of people trying to get their dissertations approved in their PhD programs. I was freelance writing articles, editing books, doing that kind of work. And at the same time, I was just beginning to homeschool my kids. And interestingly enough, in my homeschool world, there were families who were using curricula to raise their young writers, but I wasn't. I was just pulling out the books from my professional career to support me. And I had a friend who came along and she said, Julie, my kids hate writing and I don't know how to help them. You seem to know a lot about writing because she knew I was a ghostwriter and an editor. What curriculum are you using? And I said, well, I'm not using one, but show me the program you're using. And along comes this blue notebook. The opening is like a descriptive paragraph assignment with a sample at the top. So I read the paragraph and I said to her, have you read this paragraph? She said, yes. Said, did you like that paragraph, that sample of a descriptive paragraph? She says, I don't know. I can't really remember it. And so then I asked her this question. I said, listen, if that paragraph is that unremarkable and unmemorable, why are we using this program to teach writing to your children? And for her, it was this big light bulb moment, but it was also a light bulb for me because I didn't realize that in the homeschool space, parents were still using antiquated writing instruction methods that actually undermine the goal of growing a writer. So that's really how it all started.
That's amazing. And I'm really interested to dive into, the homeschooling aspect of that journey and also, the modern ways of teaching writing. But just before we do that, I also wanted to ask about your travel. And it was my understanding is that you've lived in different places, you've been to a lot of different places. I'm just curious about that part of your journey as well, and whether and how it intersects with, your homeschooling experience and your writing experience.
Yeah, 100% it does. So much overlap. When I was in college, I decided to study abroad in France, learned to speak French, went to school at a French university. And it was there that I first experienced practices we use in Brave Writer, copy work and dictation. The French really believe in dictée, which means sitting and listening to a passage read aloud, and then you handwrite it and try to do it accurately. In fact, just a couple years ago, they had a grand dictée, a big dictation in front of the Champs-Élysées in Paris, and 1,000 French people showed up to do it. Like, this is a passion of theirs. So I had that experience while I was in college in France. But even beyond that, just being exposed to other languages, living in a different country, started to really capture my imagination around learning. By the time I was an adult, I got married and I lived in Morocco for a number of years. And that's where I met my first homeschooling families. These were Americans who had kids. I, of course, was newlywed, so no children. And I was seeing up close and personal what it looked like to curate an education that was tailor-made to your child. And that's what really captured my imagination. I had this fantastic public school experience in Malibu Canyon as a kid. But by the time I was an adult, I saw those sort of revolutionary methods slip away. And suddenly public school was much more performance and outcome-based and testing-based. And so when I first was exposed to homeschool, I saw this vision get rekindled. Like, oh, my kids can have an immersive experiential experience. They can be guided by me. I can watch the lights go on with reading the same way I would watch the lights go on with learning to walk. And all of that was just a very strong appeal. So I made the decision to homeschool before I even was engaged. And by the time my kids were born, I had read a ton and was fully on board.
Oh, amazing. Well, I'm glad we touched on the travel because I was going to ask how you got into homeschooling. It turns out they're very, very interlinked.
Yes,
Yeah.
and absolutely. And I've also spent time in Central Africa. I've been to Mexico. My son-in-law is Mexican, so I have a grandson who is bilingual. And one of the things that I really felt at the time that I was raising kids is I wanted them to be global citizens. I wasn't interested in just indoctrinating them into an American point of view. I really wanted them to feel like they were members of the global community. And as it turns out, my kids have all taken that mission very much to heart and have varying roles. I have a son who's an international human rights lawyer. I have a daughter who's married to, like I said, a Mexican artist. All my kids have studied abroad, worked abroad, traveled abroad. So I feel like that is one of the key opportunities of homeschooling, and that was definitely sourced in my experience of living abroad.
Absolutely. That really resonates with me when I think about my own kids. You know, I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I think about like how can I future proof their education for an uncertain future, a global future, fast moving future. And you know, that thought about global citizenship and exposure to a wider perspective, I think is really, really important for those things. But we can't talk about kind of revolutionary methods in education and modern methods of education without also touching on technology. And I'm really curious about your perspectives and what you're seeing, both the opportunities and maybe the challenges of generative AI.
Oh, gosh.
Has it impacted how you think about teaching, writing? How has it impacted your classes and products and your business?
What a great question. In fact, I wrote a book that came out this year called Help My Kid Hates Writing, and the final chapter is about AI. And when I was working on the draft, I said to my editor, by the time this book comes out, even what I'm writing will be obsolete. Like, it's moving so fast. And I honestly think I had a more optimistic feeling about AI at its inception than I do now. It's not to say that it can't be really powerful. For instance, I love taking the MRI notes from my doctor and popping it into ChatGPT and having it get translated into user-friendly language, right? Like, we use it for medical things. We might use it for understanding some kind of document that feels a little opaque, maybe a legal document. But where I find myself anxious for this next generation is that what I really long for kids is for them to experience the power of generating their own insight in their own vocabulary. The goal of writing, and the way I talk about it in my book, is that it is first for you and second for a reader. So much of school education writing instruction is about writing for a grade, writing for a teacher, writing to demonstrate what you've learned. But that is not really what writing is about. Writing starts as a place to clarify your own senses, your own thoughts, your own ideas, your own imagination. It's taking this sort of fuzzy set of thoughts and turning it into concrete language so that you can externalize it and take a look at it, like shake it out in the sunlight and see, do these thoughts continue to hold weight when I'm at arm's length and they're not just colliding in my brain? And then secondly, it's to share it with an interested reader. And I like to use the word interested there. Unfortunately, so often writing is taught for evaluation. And so what kids start doing is they start guessing the words that live in the mind of the teacher. Like, what does the teacher expect to see here? What does the teacher want to know from me? And they lose touch with having a genuine original writing voice. So in my work and in my book, I'm really heavily focused on returning that agency to the writing voice of kids. And here's something that we know, and I love to share this because people don't think about it. Kids don't hate writing. When the internet threw its doors open in the mid-90s, some of the first people through those doors were teenagers, and they flocked sites like MySpace, LiveJournal, Tumblr, because they couldn't wait to express themselves and have interested readers read their thoughts. We've had more students write for publication today than in the history of the human race. And yet, in school, kids routinely say they don't like writing, and it's just not a fact. They don't like being evaluated. They love to write. They love to express. So that's what I want to protect.
That's so amazing. You know, I was one of those teenagers in the 90s writing.
Of course you were.
And amazed by the freedom that it gave me and the sense of empowerment. What you were saying about writing for an interested audience also really resonates with me. It makes me think about at Outschool focus on helping kids pursue interests, and that's what by an enormous range of classes, and that being a somewhat counterintuitive path to real learning in our culture, was too often real learning is described as a learning to an audience, learning to a test, learning to satisfy other people's expectations. And it makes me think there's this alternative way of being that is not going through the motions or someone else's motions, but is pursuing your own interests. That is really exciting to me, and it's great to see that kind of set of ideas come out in how you approach writing and how you evaluate what the purpose of AI is with respect to writing. So,
well, exactly that. So one of the reasons students rely on AI in high school or college in particular is because they have goals, and those goals have been defined for them by the establishment. So for instance, if you get straight A's, you're likely to get into those honors classes or those AP classes. And those are the keys to getting into the college you want to be in. And then once you're in that college and you get some kind of scholarship, now you've got to maintain this certain GPA in order to keep the money coming. That level of pressure leads to students looking for the most effective tool to protect their interests. And AI came along and said, I'm that tool. And kids then at first especially found out that, yep, it really was. Now, of course, things are shifting. I met with some professors from the University of Cincinnati recently who were saying to me that they've started doing in-class writing, which, by the way, I'm a huge fan of, but also just changing like what the assignments are. Like it's possible that we're at the end of the academic essay as the chief way to demonstrate how you've learned. I mean, if you think about it, the academic essay lasts for about 8 years in your entire life. So if you live to 80, like however many of those years, do the math for me, 10% of that would be 8 years of your life. And the rest of your life, you're not writing essays. So if we recognize that writing these essays is mostly to fulfill some kind of an academic vision, maybe we can also change what kind of performance we use to create a demonstration of learning. I'll give you one example. One of these AI biolab professors at University of Cincinnati told me that he has his students create short form video. And it requires a lot of writing, but AI cannot do the whole thing for you. You really have to coordinate all these different, pieces of data. You have to vet to make sure the data is true. It's got to be clever and funny. He had his students uploading these short form videos to YouTube, and then they were paying attention to which videos did the best in an audience sense. And these students were all in. They didn't want to use AI because they were actually enjoying the experience of creating the videos. And so I think one of the things we have to recognize is that education is going through a revolution. And from my perspective, AI is exposing the weaknesses of a graded evaluation system. And it is time for us to revolutionize how we demonstrate learning.
100%. I think that's exactly right. It's almost like AI is the pinnacle of a certain way of thinking that's now being commoditized. And in my view, it's the human elements that are valuable and scarce. And AI is a tool for empowerment, because for the first time ever, we've got this tool which has digested enormous amounts of human language and has the capability to distill it. And our job as humans is to add to what is already known with our own uniqueness. And that's much more internal focused and creativity focused than just, churning out yet another essay for grades. At least that's I'm
100% on board with you there. One of the tools that a lot of professors are using is something called a zine. Have you ever heard of a zine? They're like these little tiny booklets, sort of taken from magazine to demonstrate a certain topic. And so you can fill it with quotes or data or information, but it's assembled from cutting up magazines or printing out words. It's visual. And students absolutely love it, because when is the last time they're allowed to cut and paste and use color? There is such a lack of lifeblood in digital spaces, right? We don't even get to hold our own music that we own anymore. There's no perusing, the CD file, or in my case, records, right? That whole collection was like a thing I owned and I could touch and I could riff off of. So what we're recognizing is that if we can invite kids back into a kinesthetic relationship with their original writing voices, they are eager to self-express. That is the antidote. And it doesn't mean AI doesn't have a role going forward. It's just, I hope it isn't to hijack their voice.
I guess it must give the words meaning if it's part of them in the sense of they can touch and feel it, and it's something that's great.
Yeah,
it's amazing. Let's talk a bit about what I understand is another part of your approach, which is to treat the parents as a writing coach and to empower them to realize that they are, in fact, the writing coach. Why did you take that approach? What was the origin of that approach?
Gosh, these are wonderful questions. And this is maybe my favorite one that you're asking me. Back when I had that epiphany with this other friend of mine, and I was looking at this curriculum she was using that I knew was causing problems for her kids, I realized I could teach her children, but they would be going back to the same mother that night. The mother whose own perspective about writing had not yet been transformed. So rather than doing online classes where I was teaching kids, I like to say, I don't know for sure if it's true, but I think I'm the first online homeschool class that ever existed. I started in January of 2000, and I used an email list. And I charged $25 a person. They mailed me checks. I had no other way to take money. And I taught the parents. And so I did it in a group format. There were like 25 families. And the parents would be emailing with me, and I would send them the instructions, and then they would work with their child and then email back the child's writing. But everyone in the group could see all the interacting, the writing, my feedback, the parenting questions. And what we learned together was that I could model the kind of feedback I hoped parents would eventually give to their own children. And I could answer their questions and train them in this other way of thinking. So my goal was to transform the home educator who had the primary responsibility for their children, while their children experienced what it was like to have a coach instead of a teacher. And so that's how it started. And we've continued that way ever since. We do have some classes where kids can take them solo, but our foundational writing class trains the parent.
Well, we at Outschool have a lot to owe you for if you did the first online class. I feel like we're your ideological descendants.
Well, yeah, and you scooped me on the technology, that's for sure. But I will say, we've created our own classroom format that we use that works well for our program. And we have so many happy Outschool users in Brave Writer. I mean, we certainly know all about it. Yeah.
so delighted for that, and so delighted for the tapestry in our alternative education ecosystem, that our organizations can exist and be mutually supportive and valued by families in the way that they are.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see. And, let's talk more about the trends you're seeing in homeschooling, because of course there was the COVID emergency.
Yeah.
Many families were forced at scale to have their kids home. I'd hesitate to call it homeschooling in the sense we usually mean it, but they were exposed to a different way of interacting with their kids' education. And after COVID, I think it remains a revelation that really opened people's minds, both to some of the challenges with the existing system and existing ways of thinking, as well as the opportunities that alternatives offer. And I think, some evidence of this is, of course, in the metrics, the statistics for showing the homeschooling. And also, I think also tellingly in the continued anxiety, increased anxiety that people have with traditional systems. But I'm wondering, where does this go?
I mean, are you a fortune teller? I need to know too.
Well, it's good to speculate, because if anyone's going to have this vision for the future, we should have it. But yeah, it's difficult because it is uncertain. I guess where do you want it to go? Maybe is a better framing of the question.
Gosh, both of those are great, though. I think old school homeschool, especially pre-internet, was very, it was local. Homeschooling was local. So you found your friends either through, a preschool group or your church or your La Leche League group or whatever, and you would actually meet at the park or meet in someone's home. I was in a little co-op with 5 families at one point, and it was just meeting in each other's homes and throwing these educational parties and having our kids have play dates. That was the way homeschooling was in the early 90s. When the internet came along, it offered the opportunity for home educators to meet each other from across the world, to create sort of an ecosystem that looked more deeply at specific ideological styles of homeschooling instead of just, well, we all homeschool and we all live in the same area. Now it was like, well, I can hang out with classical educators all on this discussion board, or I can join an email list for Charlotte Mason or Montessori. And so what that did is it kind of fractured or fragmented a little bit the local expressions. And sometimes those local expressions got very rigid. They started having statements of faith or ideological purity strategies for who could join and who wasn't allowed in. The unschooling group wouldn't let anyone in if they used a piece of curricula. It got really ideological. And my hope, and the thing that I've worked really hard to do in my space, is to make room for people to pick and choose, to treat home education like a buffet of ideas, to test things, to not feel beholden to prove who you are. So all that was happening leading up to 2019 when I released my book, The Brave Learner. Well, wouldn't you know, exactly a year after it released, COVID hit. And I went on a second round of all these interviews. And the first year, I'd be on these radio shows and podcasts, and they'd be like, what about socialization? And what about educational, criteria? The next year, they were saying things like, so you're a homeschooler, you've figured out socialization. What should we do for our kids? And I was like, what is happening? Like suddenly this thing that has been vilified is suddenly like the gold standard. And so parents kind of got this opportunity to experiment with homeschooling without any risk, right? They were already out of the system, so they could try it for a year or two. And many of those families stuck. But here's what I've noticed since COVID. It feels like people want the outcome of homeschooling, but they're more stressed than ever and don't want to be the one to provide it. So instead of like a group of 5 families where you evenly divide the work, you've got 5 families joining up and hiring a teacher to do the homeschooling. Or you've got a group of families all going to a hybrid school where they've hired teachers and the kids are dropped off. When I was in a co-op, the parents weren't allowed to leave. We all participated all day to create this community feel. Now they're calling it homeschool, but it's actually not at home. There are teachers that are hired or there are parents who are running it. And it's more like a small school trying to get a homeschool outcome. Are you seeing this? This is a lot what I'm seeing.
This reminds me of what I'm seeing in the micro school movements,
Yes.
which and the distinction I make. There's several key distinctions between a micro school and a co-op. Micro schools can be a little bit larger. They tend to be more teacher entrepreneur led rather than parent led. Because I would even call a co-op that hires a teacher, but it's fundamentally the parents who are the administrators. I would still call that a co-op, whereas a micro school is started by a teacher with a vision and attracts families who are oriented to that vision. But I think this clarifies a bit what I think things should go, which is that I don't think we should lose the participatory nature of the core homeschool experience. The idea that the parent is more hands-on, is not treating their kids' education like a consumer. They're not just there to pick the school, and so participatory orientation. But I wonder if it's possible for some middle ground to this, where there is a participatory orientation, and yet it's possible to get support. Because I think what's been challenging is there's been such a large gap in that in between place. Can you have both, and as a result scale up the participatory ideas of homeschooling?
I so agree with that analysis, and I love that distinction between a co-op and a micro school. That I will take that from this interview with me, because I think that's a really good distinction. One of the things I try to advocate for, especially with people who, weren't fantasizing about homeschooling. They kind of fell into it and then they kind of fell out of it, or they're like, okay, 2 years was great, but I didn't want to do 10. I always remind them that they still have the most time with their child of anyone on the planet. And so if you want your child to experience some of the benefits of homeschool, that can happen after school, that can happen on weekends, that can happen at bedtime. What I try to teach in my books, The Brave Learner, Raising Critical Thinkers, even my new one, is the kinds of questions that lead to an education. So if we think education at home is just going through a bunch of textbooks, that's really not that different than school. You may as well put them in school and let them have friends, But if you want your kids to have this alternate education, that does start at home, and it can happen around the edges of traditional. I'll give you a little example. When we were raising our kids, my husband was a composition teacher, and we're both very literary types of people. And so we would be watching, like, let's say a Disney movie, like Mulan or something, and we would have our little remote control. And after the opening scene, they're always like a chase scene at the beginning. We would pause it and we'd say, okay, who are we rooting for right now? Which one? This guy or this guy? And then they would tell us, and we'd say, okay, but how do we know? How do we know who we're rooting for? So you're just introducing a little bit of like critical reflection, not just passive consumption. And then you get a little further in and you're like, okay, that music just changed. Does that feel like things are going to get better or worse? And so you're kind of keying them into what's happening naturally, but you're giving them the observational tools to make it have meaning. I remember my mother was babysitting one time while my husband and I were out of town, and they were watching a movie, and my son Jacob was 7 years old, and he grabbed the remote control and paused it like 10 minutes in, and he turned to my mother and said, "This is the time when we talk about what we're watching." And my mother was like, what? It's that. It's when your child is 6, 7, 8, and they burst into the kitchen with a story to tell, you grab a sheet of paper, you stop cooking dinner, and you jot down their words. And then at the dinner table, you read back what they said to you and treat it like writing. These are ways we make learning, living, and active in the lives of children, whether or not we homeschool. So I like to recommend that if you have like this yearning for the fruit, but you don't have the stamina for the execution, learn enough to be that kind of resource in the off hours, and your kids will thrive.
That's amazing advice. I'm going to take that and immediately try to start applying it with my kids. I mean, this sounds like very powerful technology to really kind of build a relationship with them, even more than learning. So thank you for those tips. What other pieces of advice more generally would you give parents considering homeschooling?
For homeschooling, the main thing is desire. So it can't just be a desire for outcome. It has to be a desire for engagement. And homeschooling at its core is a relationship. It's three kinds of relationships. It's encouraging a relationship with self in your child, like your child getting to express, yeah, I really love this. I really don't like that. I'm really interested in this. I'm not interested in that. These are the thoughts I want to reveal. And so you value them enough to write them down so your child sees that they carry weight and they have meaning. So that first relationship. Then the second is with a loving person who values learning, and hopefully that's you. They need a guide, somebody who acts as a mirror, somebody who also models what it's like to be a learner. When I was raising kids, I got really interested in art history. That wasn't their interest, that was mine. But I used to watch these Sister Wendy story of painting videos right in the middle of the school day. I would just be like, yeah, we're not doing math. I need to watch this. And now they're just hovering in the background. But all my kids love art now because art was something meaningful to me. And I took them along on the journey. I didn't hold them accountable. I just lived a passion in front of them. So a relationship with a learner really matters. And then the third is the relationship with the subject. And your chief responsibility as the adult who wants to homeschool is to make sure that you are the match.com of subjects and children, right? You got to put this, this subject called math in the most flattering outfit. You got to give it a reason for your child to be interested. We can't just say, start dating math. It's ugly. It's in a textbook. It's boring. No, we got to spice it up a little. That might mean using M&Ms to learn times tables. It might mean doing math by playing Yahtzee. It might mean trading math facts while you're having hot chocolate. Like there are ways to sort of be that matchmaker with the subject area. So if your child develops a relationship with themselves, an active learner, and the subject, they will get a great education. And that is the job of a homeschooler. So you can ask yourself if those things appeal to you. It's not about schedule. It's not about testing. It's not about being good at anything. It's just those three things. Are those interesting to you? Would you want to spend your day doing those?
And it comes back to where we started with your story when you read that paragraph from a standard curriculum and realized it was not interesting. And yet trying to teach you writing, like, honestly, like, this is a bit spicy, in education and in ed tech, I feel my heart draining and my energy draining. Talking about outcomes and tests and accountability and all this stuff. And, from a rational perspective, I can understand why those things exist and why you might consider it being important. But I just think we have completely lost the plot if we think that's what learning and education is about and what edtech should be about. And there's a soul to what you're describing, which I think is really, really important. And yes, we should use technology, we should use tools, we should build systems, of course, but we can't lose the heart of what education means.
Your comment about ed tech reminds me of when you asked the earlier question. I wanted to say it and then I held back. But I'm really nervous about AI agent-led learning. I know there can be some value to tailor-made education for certain skills. I'm not against that. But if a child's day becomes sitting in front of a screen, and often the technology is developed by people who are good at technology, they're not natural educators, what you wind up with is cranking through PowerPoints and having progress bars, and learning becomes like jumping through social media type metrics. Did you fulfill this? And it shows up on a progress bar. And I really want kids to have that experience of things being off the screen, where their whole bodies and their taste buds and their ears and their noses are involved. I remember when my daughter was doing biology, I had her sign up for biology at our co-op with these two nurses who were running the class because they were going to do 10 dissections, real dissections. The local high school was using computer simulations already for biology. And I was like, no, this is the opposite of what I want. We are losing very rapidly that tactile. It's happening even with the physical act of handwriting. There is so much scrolling and swiping and tapping, and we're losing sort of the muscular learning style. And I know, believe me, I type my books. I don't handwrite them. I'm not saying typing isn't valuable. It's the most valuable. But for the experience of learning, we want it as immersive as possible because that's when it sticks. And that's when it becomes a personal possession, which is what we want for our kids.
I think the ideas that you just expressed and what we're talking about here is a key reason why there hasn't been more widespread progress in education, why technology and standard ways that technology is used to try and improve things or change things in education never seems to work. And I think it's because there's an ideological problem. We keep on trying to apply technology to go fast, easier, still with this consumption-oriented mindset, still trying to take it and put it in a box over here and just squeeze it down and make it more efficient rather than making it more integrated and making it more whole. I think technology can be used in that way. It just tends to be attached to incorrect ideologies that, philosophers can tell us exactly where they come from. I have some thoughts about the Industrial Revolution and the origins of some of these unspoken beliefs that we have, which I think are holding us back. So it's wonderful to hear the way you think about it, because I feel a real resonance. I think our audience will as well. So let's get spicy.
Okay.
This is the Outspoken podcast. I want to know, what are you most outspoken about in education? What do you wish that everyone in your space would understand, but might be counterintuitive or even controversial?
Yeah, I don't believe in grades. That's my big thing. I think grading is useless and I think it's harmful. The way that I talk about it is that grades are for adults, they're never for kids. And so when we talk about delivering grades or grading student work, what we're saying is, I hope that you will live up to whatever my imagined ideal is so that I can confirm for you that you met my expectations. Kids don't care about that. Kids are on a path. And when there's a roadblock or they're bored or they're not studying well, it's not because you didn't give them a good grade, or a good or bad grade isn't going to motivate change unless you've indoctrinated them into the culture of grades. But for most kids, grades are not the equivalent of learning. They are a metric that adults value, and they have to be coerced into caring. I gave this example not too long ago in my space. When I was in 6th grade, I went through sort of a friend crisis, and I started not doing well in school. I was getting like a C in my English class. And my teacher at the time came to me and she said, "Julie, why are you getting a C?" And I said, "I don't care." So she's like, "But you're really good at writing and you seem to love this class. I don't get why you're getting a C." Now, part of the reason I was getting a C is I wasn't turning in homework because I was a little undiagnosed ADHD and it was staying in my locker, or I wasn't doing it. I don't know what was happening. I was just a little out of it that year. So she said to me, "Well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to introduce you to the A student in this class, because I think if you hang out with people who get A's, you'll start getting A's." Sure enough, I met her. She became my best friend. I never got another B. But here's what's really crazy, or C. I got all A's. I was an A student after that. But here's the crazy thing. I learned how to be a great student so I could get A's. But I felt like a fraud my entire life. Because if I took a test and got an A, I knew 3 weeks later I couldn't take that same test and get an A. I got really good at the tools and skills that prove I'm a high quality student, which is what teachers and admissions programs value. But where I was really learning was at home. I spent all this time, I was remembering recently, I had this story notebook. I would write short stories every day. I used to work on description by picking the most dull item in my bedroom and seeing if I could write an interesting description of a dull item. I had a poetry notebook. I played all these word games. Sometimes I made up the other person to play it with me, and I played both sides of the game because I was passionate about language and writing. When I got into theater, all I wanted to do was act. I memorized an entire script. I was Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz before the first rehearsal. Like, this was motivated by deep passion. And yet, if you asked me to get an A on a history test, I could do it, but I wasn't retaining it. And so I think that for me is like the line. What homeschool offers is a way to allow children to experience mastery and expertise, which is what makes you feel good about being who you are. And it can be in anything. And one of my most popular quotes is, "Anything can teach everything, and everything can teach anything."
That resonates so much. And your comments about mastery and expertise being possible to gain without grades, I think
Yes.
really counterintuitive. I hadn't really, I've had similar thoughts about grades, but I hadn't really figured out that there's a separation there that people conflate, that you need grades in order to be able to prove mastery, but who are you trying to prove it to? The most important person to prove it to is yourself. And then, of course, you might need some other ways to demonstrate it to others.
Yes.
Grades aren't necessary for that, but that's a secondary outcome from proving it to yourself. You've been really inspiring to me as an education change maker. I'd love to know who inspires you, and maybe you could share a couple of education change makers that you admire and want listeners to know about.
So the first person it just died this year, and he became a friend. His name is Peter Elbow. He wrote this famous book called Writing with Power. And I read it back in the year it came out, I think 1981. My mother had it on her bookshelf. And I remember reading it thinking, oh, other people write the way I write. He talked about free writing and making little margin notes and multiple drafts. And it was just very much the way I thought about writing, but from this very articulate place. He was the professor emeritus at University of Amherst in Massachusetts and ran this writing organization. So when I first wrote my very first curriculum called The Writer's Jungle, I was 38 years old. I printed it out, stuck it in a notebook, and had the temerity to mail it to him. A little homeschooler, right? And it's like the late 90s or whatever, 99 or 2000. And amazingly, he wrote me back and he thanked me for wanting to reach like an audience with some of his ideas. And then we developed a friendship over the next 25 years. And so he had a big influence on me. And I would say, here's one of the cool things he said, and maybe it ties in with my last comment. He said, Julie, you've gotten to do the thing I never got to do, which is teach writing without grades. He said, no matter how much freedom I gave in my college classes, the students still knew they'd get a grade at the end of the semester. Mm-hmm. But what you're doing is evaluation free. It's not performance, it's engagement. And so what I really long for, and I will tell you this, I've spoken with countless adults who have traumatic memories from writing feedback in school. Like that is widespread. Writing feedback is universally traumatizing at some point in your life. There is almost always someone who misread you, said a harsh thing, misunderstood your goal, treated what you offered as though it was substandard. And so what I have learned is that from Peter Elbow and then from my work with families is that when we value the attempt at communication, even if it's, I hate this is stupid, why do I have to write this? If we start with, wow, thanks for being honest and writing that down, we get further. So Peter Elbow would be the writing source of inspiration. And then the homeschooler who had the biggest influence on me is Charlotte Mason, for sure. There is something about her love of that feast of ideas and the idea that education is the science of relations, connections between ideas and subjects that really fueled my imagination. And it is sort of the underlying storyline of how I view homeschooling. So those are the two.
Amazing. And then in terms of what listeners can do, what are the top one or two things that you think our listeners can do to make change happen in education?
Well, the first thing is to take your children seriously. They're more interesting than you are. So stop lecturing, quit telling them things they should care about, put aside your ego and pay attention to what they care about. If you have a child who's obsessed with Roblox, get a chair without announcing and sit next to that child and watch them play for an hour. If you have a child who is telling you a little story that they're excited about, stop what you're doing, write it down. Later, read it back in front of them to the family and let them see you value the thoughts that already live inside them. If you have a child who wants to play a game and they're supposed to be doing math, put the math away and play the game. I had a friend early in my homeschooling career say, anytime a child asks to play a game, stop what you're doing and play it. I took that as excellent advice. It's shocking how much you learn playing games, and we treat the games like they're the entertainment. And yet, a lot of the academic stuff they're doing, they're not retaining because it's too boring. It doesn't actually engage their minds in a complex way. Kids need complexity not difficulty. Those are not the same. Complexity means they're engaging multiple aspects of their brain. Difficulty means they're being asked to do something they're not ready to do. So think in terms of multi-sensory or multi-discipline kinds of activities, and you will get their interest, and then they will learn. So those would be like a couple of ways you could get kicked off.
That's amazing. And, when I reflect on things that hold me back from acting in the ways that you describe, I think a lot about just the what I think are fairly normal fears and anxieties about being a parent. Am I doing it right? Are they doing it right? Is this going to end badly somehow?
For sure.
I think as parents, a large chunk of our job needs to be calming our own anxieties, because I think it does damage. I think it does damage to our kids.
You're so right. And I will just remind everyone that parents with kids in school have the same anxiety. They have less control, though. So they're over there saying, oh my gosh, is my child learning enough? Is this teacher right? Is this textbook good? You have no control. At least at home, you can be like, well, maybe I'll try something else. Maybe I'll talk to a friend. Maybe we'll pivot tomorrow. Like you're a little skiff out in the ocean, and it's much easier.
You have to manage your own anxiety as parents. You've got to worry about everyone else's too.
That's exactly right. And honestly, here's the thing about homeschooling. The first 2 years, it's such a watershed experience that, you're going to feel a little overwhelmed. But as you settle into it, I had a friend say anytime she was worried her kids weren't learning enough, she would take the child that she worried about out for a coffee. And then one conversation would reassure her, because kids are really smart. And when you spend time talking to them, you find out all the things they know that you weren't paying attention to because you're too busy making dinner, and running errands and doing the things you have to do.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom today and your inspiration. You mentioned your book as we went along. Would you hold it up again and just remind the readers the title and because I'm sure many will want to learn more about your thoughts.
Yeah, this book is called Help My Kid Hates Writing: How to Turn Struggling Students into Brave Writers. I wrote it because so many parents have kids who, just wilt. Maybe they don't hate writing, but they resist writing. They don't like writing. They don't want to do revision. They have some aspect of the writing journey that feels challenging. And I flipped the script on every aspect of writing, from the drafting stage to using these different revision tactics. Like, just getting kids to change the original is really tricky. So one of the things that I suggest is getting a die and rolling the die. And let's say it lands on 3, and you say, find 3 words to change. And that's all they have to do that one time. Or turn this little paragraph into a lie. Just by flipping the meaning, it helps them imagine new possibilities. So we've got like low stakes and high stakes revision strategies. I teach you the kind of feedback that you can give as an interested reader instead of as an evaluator. And I model that for you. So even if you have kids who love writing, this book is just chock full of counter-cultural practices that actually create good writing. And they're drawn from the world of professional writing instruction, where pros teach people who want to get paid to write, and they use some of these ideas in the way that they teach.
And now, based on our conversation, I can see how this is more than writing. Obviously, writing is really important, but I can see how these ideas then link into wider benefits for kids. And
you caught on. I often have people who take our classes and they say, oh my gosh, my whole homeschool changed after I understood how to talk to my kids about writing, because now they understand how to talk to them about math or science too. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. We have to close it there, but I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much, Julie. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Well, that was Julie Bogart, creator and owner of Brave Writer. I'm sorry that I missed the conversation with Amir, but as an often struggling writer myself, I'm excited to try out some of Julie's writing tips and give it the dice a roll, and I hope you'll do the same. As you know by now, the education revolution requires parents and children alike to build their confidence and do hard things like teaching and learning writing. Subscribe to Outspoken for more radical voices all season long. Share this episode with someone or anyone who is struggling with teaching their children on how to write, or considering even homeschooling their own children. And of course, learn more at outschool.org/outspoken. And until next time, stay outspoken, and keep learning your own way.